The morning light poured through the towering windows of the Harris County Courthouse in Texas, casting long, stretching shadows on the gleaming wooden benches. It was a typical Monday, tense, noisy, and crowded with people whose faces ranged from hopeful to weary. Overseeing the bustling courtroom 4B was Judge Albert Greer, a man whose reputation for stern rulings and no-nonsense demeanor was as solid as the courthouse walls. His deep voice carried across the room, demanding attention, and his quick judgments earned him both admiration and criticism, depending on who was standing before him. Amid the shuffle of papers and echoing footsteps, the clerk's voice rang out, announcing the next case, Case 5-3-2-1, Michelle Carter, minor traffic violation. The defendant stepped forward, a poised black woman in her late 30s, dressed in an impeccable dark navy suit. Her presence was striking, exuding quiet confidence, but her face betrayed a subtle mix of frustration and resignation. She was different from the usual defendants who appeared before Judge Greer, those who fidgeted nervously or showed up completely unprepared. Michelle stood still, scanning the room with a calm, almost unsettling intensity, as though she were accustomed to being under scrutiny. Judge Greer didn't immediately lift his gaze from the file before him. He spoke without looking up, his voice steady but without a hint of warmth. "Miss Carter," he began. "You've been charged with failure to signal a lane change. Do you contest this?" Michelle drew in a deep breath, steadying herself before responding. "Your Honor, I would like to clarify." But before she could finish, Judge Greer cut her off with a sharp wave of his hand. "Not a debate, Miss Carter. This is a courtroom, not a platform for excuses. Do you contest the charge or not?" A faint murmur rippled through the gallery, underscoring the rising tension. Michelle's jaw tightened briefly, but she quickly composed herself. "No, Your Honor," she replied, her tone even and calm. Judge Greer leaned back in his chair, his eyes finally meeting hers. They lingered there, assessing, searching, as if looking for something he couldn't name. After a long pause, he delivered his ruling with finality. "Then I see no reason for leniency. You are fined $1,000, payable within 30 days. Next case." The gavel struck, the sound echoing through the room like thunder, silencing even the faintest whispers. Michelle's expression remained unchanged, her composure intact, though a flicker of disappointment flashed across her face. She gave a polite nod to the judge and turned to leave the courtroom, but as she walked past the bench, Greer's gaze followed her. There was something about her that unsettled him, not in the way that guilt or defiance might, but in a way he couldn't quite place. He shrugged the thought aside and moved on, his voice ringing out once more. As the courtroom returned to its rhythm, Michelle Carter's presence hung in the air, lingering like a story left untold. Michelle walked out of the courtroom, her head held high, the sharp click of her heels echoing against the marble floors. The fine was harsh, perhaps unnecessarily so, but her face gave no indication of how she truly felt. Outside, the usual hum of the courthouse parking lot surrounded her, cars pulling in, others backing out, a bailiff barking orders at someone to move their vehicle. She reached her sleek black sedan, a subtle indication of her professional success, and sat in the driver's seat for a moment before starting the engine. She didn't sigh or shake her head. She simply sat there, her fingers gently drumming against the steering wheel, lost in thought. Inside the courtroom, Judge Greer had already moved on to another case. His mind was focused on the parade of defendants before him, but every so often, his thoughts drifted back to Michelle Carter. Her poise, her calmness, there was something about her that unsettled him. It wasn't defiance. It wasn't guilt. It was something he couldn't quite place. He tried to dismiss the thought, muttering to himself, "Focus, Greer," and shifted his attention back to the case at hand. The hours wore on, and by midday, the energy in the courtroom had dulled, the once tense atmosphere slipping into monotony. The judge called for a recess and retreated to his chambers to review the next set of cases. He poured himself a cup of coffee and glanced at the stack of files on his desk. Among them was a high-profile case, one that had drawn attention from the media and legal professionals alike, a white-collar criminal trial involving corporate embezzlement. It was the case of the year, and everyone was watching. As he skimmed through the details, there was a knock at the door. His clerk, a fresh-faced young man just out of law school, poked his head in. "Your Honor, the lead prosecutor for the Montgomery case is here. She's asked for a moment of your time." Greer frowned. It wasn't unusual for prosecutors to request meetings, but he preferred to keep things brief, professional. He nodded curtly and stood, smoothing the front of his robe. But when he stepped out of his chambers, his breath caught in his throat. There, standing with a clipboard in hand, was Michelle Carter. She wasn't dressed in the navy suit anymore. Instead, she wore a sharp black blazer and a crisp white blouse, an outfit that commanded attention without saying a word. The nameplate badge on her chest gleamed under the fluorescent lights. Michelle Carter, Chief Prosecutor. Greer's face remained composed, but inside, his mind raced. He realized, with a jolt of embarrassment, that he hadn't looked closely at the docket that morning. He hadn't considered the possibility that the defendant in his courtroom was anything more than a name on a case file. Michelle extended her hand, her expression neutral but tinged with polite professionalism. "Good afternoon, Your Honor. I'm Michelle Carter, Chief Prosecutor on the Montgomery case." Greer took her hand, his grip firm but hesitant. "Miss Carter," he replied, his voice carefully measured. "I wasn't expecting to see you again so soon." Her lips curved into a faint, polite smile. "Life's full of surprises, isn't it?" And just like that, the power dynamics in the room shifted. The unsettling feeling inside Greer grew stronger, and he realized with a rising unease that he had misjudged Michelle Carter in a way he couldn't ignore. The afternoon session began anew, and the tension in the room was palpable. The air thickened with an unspoken reckoning, as if the courtroom itself could feel the weight of the moment. Michelle Carter stood tall, her presence commanding, as she resumed leading the prosecution with unparalleled precision. Her voice was unwavering, slicing through the defense's feeble attempts to cast doubt. Every word she spoke seemed to carry the weight of truth, forcing the room to shift with her every argument. The judge, Greer, sat perched at his bench, his sharp gaze never leaving Michelle. There was no denying the ease with which she controlled the room. It was almost as if she was the only one moving within the confines of the law. Her cross-examinations were surgical, her questions clean and deliberate, cutting through the defense like a hot knife through butter. Even the defense attorney, a man with years of experience in his craft, seemed to stumble under the weight of her questioning. The defendant, a man nearing his 60s with a meticulously crafted appearance, squirmed in his seat, the facade of confidence cracking as Michelle picked apart his statements, one after another. With each inconsistency she exposed, the courtroom seemed to breathe a collective gasp. Her case was building, piece by piece, a masterpiece in real time. Greer's focus deepened, his posture shifting as he leaned forward ever so slightly. His mind was engaged, he could feel it, and for a brief moment, he let himself forget the invisible walls between him and the trial, between him and Michelle. He quickly straightened, as if catching himself, and returned to his neutral stance, gripping the armrests of his chair. The trial had always been about fairness, about truth. Yet, something about Michelle Carter, something about this case, was making him question everything. He wasn't supposed to feel this way. But as he watched her, as he listened to the precision in her voice, he couldn't help but wonder if the trial wasn't just about the facts, it was about something more. A brief recess allowed him a moment of solitude by the water cooler. But even here, his thoughts swirled uncontrollably. He hadn't heard Michelle approach until she spoke, her voice breaking his reverie. "Your Honor," she began, her tone respectful yet resolute, "I wanted to thank you for keeping the proceedings efficient today." Greer turned, meeting her gaze, and saw no trace of mockery, only a quiet professionalism. But beneath her words, there was something else. A challenge. A reminder of their earlier conversation. "You're running a tight case, Miss Carter," he replied, carefully neutral. "The jury seems to be following your arguments closely." She nodded but didn't break eye contact, her words deliberate. "Justice matters, Your Honor. Every detail counts." The weight of her statement lingered in the air long after she walked away, leaving Greer to ponder its meaning. When he returned to his chambers, the door clicking shut behind him, he sat at his desk, lost in thought. Papers lay scattered in front of him, but he wasn't seeing them. He had spent decades on the bench, certain in his ability to sift through lies and deception to find the truth. But this case, Michelle, was making him question whether he had truly seen the truth all along. He had prided himself on fairness, but the realization gnawed at him. Had he been too quick to judge? Had his assumptions clouded his decisions? As the trial resumed, something in Greer had shifted. There was a subtle change in his demeanor, a newfound deliberateness in his every action. His eyes sharpened. His ears tuned in more closely. And as Michelle continued her questioning, he found himself not just observing her, but learning from her. The trial reached its conclusion, and as Michelle delivered her closing arguments, Greer couldn't help but reflect, not just on the case, but on his own role in it. Her words were sharp, deliberate, and unwavering. She spoke of greed, betrayal, and the unyielding need for accountability. The jury's faces were locked in concentration, and the courtroom hung on her every syllable. Greer, however, was far from detached. His thoughts drifted between Michelle's arguments and the uncomfortable realization that he had let his biases color his judgments. As Michelle sat down, there was a quiet finality to her presence. Her words had done their work. The defense stumbled through their closing statement, but it was clear to everyone, Michelle had won this battle, not with force, but with truth. The jury deliberated, and when they returned, Greer could feel the heaviness in the room. The moment was almost too much to bear. The foreperson, a woman in a navy blazer, stood and unfolded the paper that would determine the defendant's fate. "We find the defendant guilty on all counts," she declared with unshakable certainty. A murmur swept through the gallery, but Greer's gavel slammed down, silencing the room. The defendant, his well-maintained composure shattered, slumped in his chair. Justice had been served. Michelle's team exchanged quiet nods, no cheers, no celebrations. For Michelle, this was never about triumph, it was about upholding the principles that had driven her through the case. As the defendant was led away in handcuffs, the flash of cameras filled the air. Greer dismissed the jury, but even as he adjourned the court for the day, he found himself lingering at his bench. Michelle's presence still hung in the room. She paused by the door, her gaze meeting his once more. There was no bitterness, only understanding. A silent acknowledgement of the shift between them. She nodded, not just at the case, but at the unspoken change in the judge. That evening, Greer sat alone in his chambers, his mind replaying the trial. Michelle Carter. Her poise. Her words. Her strength in the face of adversity. She had made him see what he hadn't before, the subtle ways in which assumptions could shape even the most fair and experienced judge. It wasn't a comfortable realization, but it was one he had to face. As he leaned back in his chair, the events of the day swirling around him, Greer understood that justice wasn't just about verdicts, it was about people. Every person had a story. Michelle Carter had reminded him of that truth. And for the first time, he truly understood it. The courthouse emptied for the night, but Greer knew this trial had changed him. He had learned a lesson he would carry with him forever, not just in his courtroom, but in every decision he made. And as he reflected on the trial, he knew that this journey was far from over.